winter of 1847, on a stretch of low country where cane fields met black water and the marsh could swallow a horse in 3 heartbeats, a planter named Josiah Calder made a choice that would rot the roots of 3 parishes. He would die on paper so his debts could live on as someone else's problem. And he would not go into that false grave alone. He would force a man he owned to vanish with him, body and name folded up like a letter nobody dared open. Before we drag the coffin into the light, do one thing for me. If you are listening in the dark or driving a long road, subscribe and tap the bell. Stories like this, stories families varnish and hide, need witnesses. Tell me where you are watching from, then come down into the weeds. By January, Josiah's ledgers looked like they'd been kept with a knife. Crop failures, a hurricane that took his roof and 2 rows of slave cabins, a note from the Charleston Mutual that was coming due with the appetite of a river. He wore the respectable look linen, cane, a voice that sounded borrowed from a judge, but at night he paced the veranda counting in whispers. Ships missed, barrels molded, boys run, loans layered. The number always ended 13 higher than he said it would. Men in that county blamed witchwork when numbers did that. Men like Josiah blamed everyone except the mirror. Jonah Reed worked in the cooper shed behind the gin house where winter crawled into bones and stayed. He built barrels so tight you could roll them in the river and not wet the salt inside. His fingers knew how to read knots like scripture. He did not talk much. He listened. That's a thing overseers hate, a quiet man with a good memory. Josiah didn't notice Jonah until he needed something built that couldn't leak. The planter came to the shed with a smile he wore like a weapon. "You are my best man with staves," he said, as if compliments could buy forgiveness in advance. "Ivy a particular commission." Jonah didn't stop planing, but he looked up. Josiah laid a hand on the bench and tapped twice. 2 taps is how a master makes a conversation feel like a command. "I need a box," Josiah said lightly, "and a boat to carry it." "Quiet work? Tonight? A coffin?" Jonah asked. His voice carried no fear, only the truth of a shape. Josiah's smile sharpened. "Something like." Out by the river bend they called Devil's Cut, a skiff lay turned on its belly. Jonah's heart, the riverman, had carved it for short runs and bad ideas. Josiah had bought it for the second reason. He ran a palm along the keel as if checking a horse's teeth. "Men drown here," he said conversationally. "Fine current for disasters. Newspapers like disasters." He seemed almost cheerful now that the plan had learned its legs. "You will build the box, you will help me weight it, and you all row me where I say. Then you all be gone, Jonah. Far from here. A kind of freedom." Jonah's hands kept working because that's what kept a man alive, motion. "Your freedom," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's the only kind there is," Josiah said, and meant it. The work began before sundown. Jonah chose cypress doesn't to warp fast, doesn't it ask questions. He cut his staves thin and tongued the edges so the seams would lock like held breath. He boiled tar until it smelled like thunder and brushed it on with the patience of a man filling cracks the world put in him. Josiah watched as if he were auditing God. Aunt Mercy Sloan, cook, midwife, and rumor C favorite doorstep, brought a lamp and set it on a barrel head. "Wind's going wrong," she told Jonah, eyes not leaving Josiah. River says tasting of brass. "Folks with sense stay home on nights like that." Josiah doffed his hat as if he were in church. "We are doing God's work, Miss Sloan. There's a wake to be set right." She looked at him long enough to make him look away. "God donned a right in your ledger," she said, and left them to the shadows. By 8, the coffin was ready. Narrow, mean, workmanlike. Josiah produced pig iron billets and a sack that clinked like teeth. "Wait," he said, "and keepsakes." He opened the sack and spilled out buttons, a ring, a river stone drilled through the middle. "Belongings," he said, savoring the word lie. "For the coroner and the whispers." "Who is the body?" Jonah asked. Josiah's smile returned, thinner now. "The river is generous. The river will provide, or we will help it look like it did. There are ways in that country to make a corpse out of nothing and convince men in collars to swear they saw one. A hat floating brim up near the cut, a coat snagged in reeds, a boot on the bank with a foot in it if you've made a deal with pigs first." Josiah had read all the tricks off other men's shame and improved them. He told Jonah the shape of the night as if talking to himself. The skiff would go out past Devil's Cut where the current clutched and let go like a drunk hand. Josiah would stand, pretend to lose his balance, shout once. Jonah would rock the boat like panic. The coffin would slide into black water with their belongings and iron dragging bubbles down. Jonah would row back alone, wordless, wild-eyed, an enslaved man who'd failed to save his master. The parish would cluck. Creditors would write wreaths and condolences. And somewhere downriver, a man with a new name would step onto a schooner and never look back. "And me?" Jonah said, soft as a saw finishing a cut. Josiah's eyes went cold the way brackish water goes when it says hiding something. "You're coming too," he said. "Just not the way you think. You will disappear in the same ink I do. A man who knows a trick is a man who can tell it. I can have that." "Kill me then," Jonah said, and the words weren't a bravado. They were a measurement, if that's the kind of vanishing you mean. "I don't waste good hands," Josiah said. "You'll come with me as proof of life, my new shadow. Someone to carry the part of my name I leave behind." He leaned in, voice smooth as spoiled cream. "Freedom, Jonah, not a lie this time. A different kind. No overseer, no bell, no whip, just me. A choice that wasn't a one settled between them like fog." They launched a little after midnight. The skiff took the weight as if it had been built to betray. The coffin lay in the belly, neat and quiet, like a story that hadn't decided the ending it wanted. The river took them because that's what rivers do. Reeds hissed. An owl changed its mind. Somewhere a bell in a black church struck once, then lost its nerve. At the mouth of Devil's Cut, the current tugged hard. Josiah stood. The skiff answered with a small, mean tilt. He spread his arms. "Hear me now," he said to nobody and everybody. "Josiah Calder dies a righteous accident. He stepped wrong on purpose." Wood screamed. Water took. The coffin slid like a tongue. Jonah grabbed for it, and didn't he iron hit riverbed and sang a note no human throat can match. The skiff slammed sideways into a snag and jammed hard. Josiah disappeared. "Josiah!" Jonah shouted, because a man does what a script demands even when he hates the play. The river gave back nothing but bubbles and one black hat that spun in a slow circle like a question trying to stay a question. Jonah wedged the oar under the snag and levered them free. The current tried to unright him. He made the boat obey anyway because hands that build true dawn to know how to fail when they retold to hold. He turned the skiff toward shore, toward shouts he could already hear, toward a yard that would swallow him as a murderer or a miracle or a tool, whichever paid best. He did not see the pale shape slide from beneath the cut and claw onto the far bank. He did not hear the wet cough, the first breath of a man reborn into a new lie. He only heard the bell 1-2 far off where the quarters slept with one ear open. It did not count to 13. It counted to 3 and stopped, like a promise interrupted. By dawn, the yard was a hive. Lanterns swang on hooks. Dogs barked the way dogs do when grown men are pretending not to be frightened. Jonah beached the skiff, crooked shoulders shaking hard enough to sell the story. The overseer, Price, grabbed him by the collar and yanked him into the light. "Where is he?" "River took him," Jonah said, voice hoarse. "Boat clipped a snag at the cut. He went under, never came up." Price wanted to whip grief into Jonah's back to make it feel like justice, but too many white faces were watching. A coroner's inquest would have to be staged, with witnesses laced into their parts. Aunt Mercy stood in the door of the cookhouse with her arms crossed, taking the whole scene into her old eyes. She nodded once when Jonah's gaze brushed hers, as though she'd read every page of the night already. By noon, a coroner from St. Matthias Parish had arrived with a clerk who wrote with his tongue peeking out like a child learning letters. They found the hat Jonah couldn't grab, the snag that flipped them, and the ring on its strings snagged in willow roots. The clerk wrote, "Accident during routine navigation." The coroner looked at Jonah long. "You tried to save him?" "I did," Jonah said. River had its way. Behind the barn, men whispered in debtors' numbers. Charleston Mutual would call the note. Probate would choke what was left. But rumors breathe better than facts. By dusk, the road was coughing up visitors with condolences like IOUs. A banker with nails clean as a new coin. A cousin who had nothing but opinions and a well-coached tear. They all wanted to see the widow. There was no widow. Josiah had never married a person he couldn't sell. Price locked Jonah in the root cellar that night for his own safety. The lock-s click said, "Temporary, until convenient." When dark thickened enough to hide a test, something slid under the door. Jonah groped and found a smooth object the size of a dove, Josiah's tobacco box. Inside, a stub of candle, a folded note, and something that tasted like iron when you touched it. A new name. The note said, "You belong to J. Pierce Caldwell now. There will be a wagon at the old rice mill at moonrise. Bring no one, make no sound, or I rewrite your ending." Jonah blew the candle out on the thought he'd just had Aunt Mercy telling him the wind tasted like brass, and pressed his palm to the dirt wall until his hand remembered the measure of packed earth. The lock turned again near midnight. Price's shadow filled the opening. "Coroner S. pleased," Price said. "Mr. Calder was a righteous man. He laughed at the lie. You belong to the estate until it S. parted out." "Keep close. I need water," Jonah said, slow, buying footfalls. Price grunted a yes and lifted the latch. In the yard, shadows moved more than there should have been. Jonah counted them with the sense carpenters have for what would-s hiding. One broke away and ghosted toward the lane. Another leaned against the sugar shed with a hat pulled low. Jonah's heart, the riverman. He tipped his hat the smallest degree. He had not come to pay respects. They walked Jonah to the well, two men with rifles braced lazy and ready. He drank long enough to memorize the yard's positions where light fell, where it didn't tee. When he straightened, Price was closer than he'd been, eyes bright with a thought. The estate could sell Jonah quick before creditors tallied lists, and Price could take his quiet cut from a trader who didn't ask about timing. From the cane road, wheels whispered. A plain wagon rolled in with 2 sacks of corn showing and a third that did not rustle like corn. The driver kept his hat low and never looked toward the house. From Hearthall he called, using the neighbor's name, Mrs. Auden sends feed. He smiled with 6 teeth. Aunt Mercy from the porch chuckled once. "Corn done to come on a night like this," she said, not loud. "Corn done to want to be seen with ghosts." Price waved it through. The wagon rattled past, and as it did, the burlap on the 3rd sack twitched barely. Jonah watched the shadow inside make a small rectangle with its hands a box shape. The coffin is outline, a message for one person. Before the moon cleared the pines, Jonah had palmed a Cooper-S peg from his sleeve and eased the cellar latch while Price paced the yard, counting what he could steal. When the next round of shouting began over at the river, someone claiming to see a body, a reward for whoever found Price, went to get loud enough to own the story. That was Jonah S. Breath. He slid into the cane, kept low, let the night's wet slap teach his face new geography. The old rice mill was a jawbone on the riverbank, half collapsed, teeth of broken pilings biting black water. The wagon waited in its shadow. Jonah's heart didn't look at him. "Get in," he said. Below, he kicked the third sack. It was empty now. A hole cut into the wagon bed gaped beneath it, square as a promise. Jonah dropped into the dark and pulled the burlap over. He lay in a wood-smelling coffin made of boards he hadn't planed. The lid slid shut and something heavy came down another sack, or a man's decision weighing itself. Wheels rolled. River mud changed the sound. After a time, the wagon stopped and hands lifted Jonah's box the way pallbearers lift a friend. He rose, swayed, and set down. Rope rasped. Then the lid groaned back and night poured over him like cold broth. Josiah stood there clean as a fresh-made lie, hair combed, clothes wrong in little ways that said he'd borrowed them from his new name. "You see," he whispered, delighted by the symmetry of his trick. "We die together." Jonah looked from the rope to the boat to the far bank where a lamp moved steady an official deputy banker, a man with all the wrong paperwork. Josiah saw the way Jonah's eyes measured the distances and made a mouth like patience. "Never look there again," he murmured. "That world is over." He handed Jonah a wool coat the color of cowards. "Put this on. We take the river east to Marshbourne. From there a sloop to Savannah. From Savannah, a packet south. I will be Mr. J. Pierce Caldwell. You will be Jack Reed." He tasted Jonah's given name like a word he intended to own. "Say it." Jonah said nothing. Jonah's heart's eyes flicked at him once. A question, not a pity. He set the skiff loose, oars whispering, tides thinking. On the third pull, Aunt Mercy's voice came from reeds like a note the river didn't want to carry. "Boy," she said to no one in particular. "If you got to go, go, remembering which way is home, which way is out, and which way is blood." Marshbourne wasn't he a town so much as a place where money changed boots. Boardwalk, 3 shacks, a tavern with a name it didn't deserve. On the backside, a dock crouched like a spider and a sloop rocked against its leash. A lantern burned at her stern, hooded. The captain's beard hung like a threat. "Caldwell?" he said, not bothering to make it a question. "This your boy." "Jack," Josiah replied smoothly. "A reliable hand." "Reliable hands don't need irons," the captain said, eyeing the neat cuff Josiah had hidden under Jonah's borrowed coat. "Dante, bring me trouble." "I bring you coin," Josiah said. "Trouble belongs to other men." They slipped down the coast in a hush of canvas, hugging marsh where the law was a rumor. At night, Josiah rehearsed his new life by lamplight, practicing a new signature until it looked like it had always been there. He had papers, a death notice already written for the St. Matthias Courier, a letter to a Charleston agent instructing him to draw on the estate to settle last matters, then forward remaining funds to Mr. J. P. Caldwell, care of a counting house in Savannah. A note to a creditor too noble to be anything but a performance, apologizing for God's poor timing. Jonah didn't sleep. He learned the sloop's noises, what creaks meant calm and which meant the sea had an idea. He counted stars because numbers told the truth if you knew how to ask them. In the morning, Josiah handed him a tin mug and spoke like a man in front of a mirror. "You think I pulled you because I fear you," he said. "I brought you because I need something true near me. Liars need true things to rub against, else their lies get lazy." Jonah drank and watched marsh porpoises break, then vanish, little ghosts practicing. "You brought me," he said, "because you don't know how to be alone." Josiah's smile flickered and brightened again. "Alone is where men go when they redone," he said. "I am not done." In Savannah, Caldwell walked the streets as if he'd paved them already, good at being someone else. He rented a room with a balcony and an audience. He bought a gray hat. He talked to a broker who kept one hand under his desk the entire time. He chose a destination whispered by men who'd bled money: New Orleans. In that river-wet city, a new name could root in a week and bloom in a month. 2 days before the packet sailed, a man with a Birmingham pistol and a Boston education came nosing through the boarding house, asking gentle questions in a voice that liked the sound of itself. Alonzo Pike, he introduced himself to the landlady, with the Mutual. He smiled wide enough to show he liked finding lies almost as much as he liked payday. "I am here about a drowning." Jonah was sweeping the hall when Pike came up the stairs. He stepped aside the way men in coats expect from men in borrowed ones. Pike's eyes were kind and rude at once. "You know your letters?" he asked conversationally. "A few," Jonah said. "Then you know the letter J," Pike said. "It has a hook, catches things." He smiled again and moved on. Jonah resumed sweeping, so his hands had something to do besides imagine the weight of a man over the side of a ship. They boarded the River Swan under a sky the color of wet tin. Down in the Macabre crowd, Pike watched from a crate with a cigar, pretending to go out. Josiah touched the brim of his gray hat to the captain as if tipping coin into a pocket he didn't intend to fill later. Jonah stowed their trunk, the false bottom one, with a ledger full of last names and the places they owed money, and then stood at the rail while the city unstitched itself behind them. Riverboats talk to the river as they go, wood to water, old friends with bad stories. In the gambling salon, Josiah became Mr. Caldwell, fully his laugh timed right, his losses small enough to be flattering. He flirted with a widow whose wedding ring was too new and a planter whose debts were too old. He learned who in the salon could be leaned on for a reference in a city upriver. Pike came strolling after supper with the ease of a man who always arrives just as a song ends. "Mr. Caldwell," he said pleasantly, "forgive me. I don't mean to intrude on your grief. I only need to copy your particulars for our records. We like to get the names right when we write checks to widows and creditors." He pronounced the last word like it was a dog he'd trained. Josiah feigned hollow-eyed gratitude. "Of course," he said, pressing a hand to his chest. "Anything that smooths sorrow's bookkeeping." Pike took out a notebook and a pencil worn blunt by patience. "Where were you born?" "Augusta," Josiah replied easily. "A miller's son. Your father's name?" "Calder," Josiah said and caught himself smiling. He corrected fast. "Caldwell. Joseph Caldwell." He laughed an apology. "Grief muddles the tongue," Pike smiled back. He'd gotten what he'd come for, proof that the man liked to step where a trap had already been placed. He tipped his hat to Jonah as if the day had gone splendidly and vanished into the night air that smelled like river mud and other people's secrets. That night, Jonah sat on his trunk and listened to Josiah sleep. Men who lie all day talk in their sleep, half confessions dressed as weather. Josiah murmured names that weren't his and a number 13 that came out no matter how he tried to hide it. Jonah would have liked to hear him say a different name, Jonah S., but he didn't. Some men can deform the truth of other people even when dreaming. The Swan hugged the coast until she was forced to lift her skirts and run. Storm came like a thought nobody had wanted. By midday, rain hit the deck hard enough to make the planks gasp. The packet swung and bucked. In the salon, somebody prayed in German, On the lower deck, chickens lost their religion entirely and told the sky exactly what they thought of it. At the worst of it, the trunk 6 feet from Jonah S. knee slid, struck a beam, and split a hair enough to cough up a page from its false bottom. Jonah S. hand was on it before the sea could claim it. He read the top line without meaning to. Committee of Receivers Mutual Aid. Beneath it, names he knew from courthouse steps and whispers in the yard. Men who, like Josiah, had learned to turn catastrophe into a meal. The ledger was a map to men who would welcome Josiah and hide him, and who might take Jonah as part of the package or cut him loose in a swamp. He folded the page and put it back, tight. He put the knowledge somewhere, tighter. New Orleans rose out of the brown water with its face painted and its hands behind its back. They took a room over a cooperage on Chupatulas where the street smelled of casks and sugar, which is to say, money. Josiah Mr. Caldwell purchased a stake in a forwarding concern that existed mostly as a reason to write letters with a believable letterhead. He joined a private coffee house with a password and a portrait of a saint nobody liked. He found the door that men like him always find. A room with green baize tables where credit moves in the dark like cats. "You'll fit," said a man with a ribbon in his buttonhole and a stain of old wine on his cuff. "You have the face of a man who doesn't enjoy losing." He slid a card across the table with a name Jonah pretended not to read. Committee of Receivers Local Chapter. At night, Josiah rehearsed a new lie, that he had a plantation upriver and had only come to town to see about transport. "I'll buy back land with borrowed money," he told Jonah with a childish joy, "and the borrowed money will be repaid with crops bought on time with other men as borrowed money. It is a circle that feeds itself." He believed it. Men like him always do until the wolves they've been feeding look around and see they alone with dinner. Jonah worked at the cooperage downstairs when he could to keep his hands obedient to something honest. The master cooper watched him bind hoops with a nod of respect that he didn't give to free white boys. "You make a barrel like you expect it to hold judgment," he observed. "Everything leaks if you wait long enough," Jonah said. In the market, Aunt Mercy's voice arrived from a distance in the shape of a Carolina woman selling okra who called him child without meaning disrespect and slid him a thread-wrapped charm when Josiah wasn't looking. "Saw you in a dream," she murmured. "River putting on a white man's hat. You get to choose which shore." He kept the charm not because he believed in charms, but because he respected anything that claimed a piece of the future and dared it to behave. A letter came with a Georgia seal that made Josiah pale for the first time since the river. Alonzo Pike, politely requesting an interview at the coffee house to ensure disbursements follow lawful channels. Another came the same day, hand-delivered by a boy with a missing tooth. A meeting of the committee at midnight. "Bring your associate. You're not my associate," Josiah said to Jonah with a little glee, "but they'll like the look of you. Makes me seem practical." He thought he was bragging. He was confessing. The committee's chamber was a sanctified room for men who had never believed in sanctity. Gaslight low chairs arranged in a half circle so guilt didn't have to complete its shape. 13 men, naturally. Jonah noted their hands first, soft, ink-stained, ringed, unused to work that wasn't cutting. The chair's smile looked practiced. His eyes kept slipping away from Jonah's face as if that truth stung. "Mr. Caldwell," he purred, "your predicament tragic. But tragedy is often instructional. We are instructive men." He laid out their terms. They would fold Josiah S. Caldwell's affairs into a holding company that owned nothing real and everything useful. In exchange, he owed them a year of services carrying letters that shouldn't exist, endorsing notes for men whose names couldn't be seen together. They had a sloop, a counting house, a lawyer who'd never lost a case because he never took one he couldn't rig 2 weeks before it was heard. And the boy? asked a member with a diamond that could have paid for 10 truths. We don't like loose ends. He's my shadow, Josiah said lightly. Goes where I go. Shadows get stepped on or lost, Jonah thought. Shadows also tell you when the light is doing something you should notice. On the way back to Chupitula's, a man peeled out of an alley with a scent of bay rum and paperwork. Pike. Apologies, he said, looming polite in the carriage light. We missed each other at the coffee house. I'd be obliged if you'd humor a few questions now. His tone left room for refusal. His eyes did not. Josiah's smile was exquisite. Of course, Pike's questions were about nothing, which is to say everything. Who had witnessed the inquest? Did Mr. Caldwell keep a prayer book in his house, and which? What hymns were sung at Mrs. Caldwell's non-existent funeral, and by whom? He was weaving a net out of threads Josiah didn't recognize as threads. Men die in nets they aren't willing to see. Then Pike turned to Jonah. And you? You were present at the accident, were you not? Jonah wrapped both hands around the hat he'd been ordered to wear. I was, he said. And can you swim? Jonah let the question sit until it dried out. No. Which is why you didn't jump in, Pike said, making it a kindness. Thank you. He tipped his hat, meaning he wasn't done. Winter bled out. Spring stepped in with jasmine like a promise and heat like a threat. Josiah became a man everyone knew because he made sure they did. He picked up a club, Habit. Mornings there reading the Picayune as if it were a ledger, and afternoons at the salon where men wrote themselves larger with every hand. Jonah moved in the spaces between market, dock, cooperage, a church where the minister preached the gospel and planned rescues under the stairs. He learned the city's whistle code. 2 notes for police, 3 for a raid, 1 long, mournful one for the kind of trouble that lasts generations. Pike let himself be seen when he wanted to be and not otherwise. He had a gift for closing doors with gentleness that felt like force. He dined with Josiah publicly twice, once making him laugh, once making him sweat so the committee would see how near the fire sat. That summer, yellow fever stalked the streets like a creditor. Men with means fled upriver. Men without lay in humid rooms counting their own breaths. Josiah stayed because he couldn't bear to leave his own legend unattended. He took to laudanum drops for sleep and made errors that men like Pike were paid to love. A misdated letter, a signature that slipped back toward Calder when he was tired, a mention of Aunt Mercy, careless, in the presence of a man who knew how to file names like nails until needed. The committee began to look at him the way a man looks at a horse gone skittish. Stability, the chair murmured privately to Jonah, although he never said the word slave, is our religion. Your employer is not devotional. Jonah said nothing. He fixed hoops and wrote a name he wasn't supposed to know Pike onto 3 scraps that would find their way through hands that knew how to carry messages with their palms shut. Hurricanes talk to a city weeks before they arrive if you know how to listen. Birds change their minds. Fish came in wrong. Men who claimed not to believe in anything began to bargain with things they didn't name. When the wind finally took the rooftops, it seemed offended that anyone had tried to nail them down. In the second hour of the blow, the committee's counting house shed its shutters like lies. Josiah fought his way across Chupitula's, clutching a valise that he swore contained only papers of small importance. Jonah, roped to a post to keep the wind from choosing his path, watched him with the calm of a man who sees the end of something reach back to shake its own hand. The next day, the city was a reflection of itself in a broken mirror. Pike came down the street calm as a parson after a harvest, hat tied with a ribbon, boots polite about puddles. He did not look at Jonah or at the committee's men hauling out mildewed ledgers to dry. He went straight to Josiah, who was exhausted enough to tell truths to the wrong face. "Mr. Caldwell," Pike said, "have you considered that your tragic accident has profited you to such a degree that the Lord himself might wish to conduct an audit?" "I am a victim," Josiah said. "Then, I am also what the times require." Then recklessly, "And men like you do not exist unless men like me make you necessary." Pike smiled because a confession dressed as philosophy is still a confession. "I prefer to think men like me exist, so men like you do not become tradition." He left with a polite tip of the hat and a look for Jonah that said, "Tomorrow." Tomorrow arrived with warrants written in a hand that expected obedience. The parish sheriff, broad, bourbon-sturdy, and reluctant to be noble, brought Pike to the cooperage as if they were calling on a friend. He asked Jonah to come along to a hearing just to put a shape to things. He said it would be fine and meant it the way men mean the tide will keep to its mind. In the courthouse chamber, the committee had filled the benches before breakfast. They never let the law sit alone. The chair smiled at Jonah with a softness he reserved for tools. "This will be simple," he murmured. "You will affirm the River S appetite, and Mr. Caldwell will be inconvenienced, and the mutual will pen a check. We will all go to lunch." But the Judge Pike S. judge for one morning at least had another appetite. He wanted a spectacle tidy enough to feel like truth. He had Pike call witnesses, the coroner, who perspired, Price, who lied from habit, a boy who swore he saw a hat spin with no head under it. Then Pike called Jonah, and the chair shifted uncomfortably because he had told himself a story in which Jonah did not speak. Pike asked his questions as if he were leaning on a fence, squinting at weather. Where was the skiff? How many iron billets? When the coffin slid, did it seem heavier going out than coming in? Had anyone spoken the words insurance or probate in Jonah S. hearing? Jonah felt the room lean forward like a crowd at a card trick. He saw Aunt Mercy in the back row, hands folded in her lap as if she were watching a child she'd taught tie his shoes. He saw Josiah S. face pinched hard enough to have bite marks on the inside of the cheeks. His heart split itself, one part for vengeance, one for survival, and then stitched itself back together because neither could live alone. He told the truth in pieces and with care, the way a cooper taps hoops hard enough to tighten but not enough to split the stave. The river had taken, the hat had spun, the coffin had gone down carrying weight and lies. He did not say, Josiah climbed out of the river on the far bank and made a new name before midnight. He did not say, I am here because he forced me to be his shadow. Pike let the silence stretch until it hummed. Then he nodded, as if that had been enough to push the cart where he wanted it. No more questions, he said, and the judge called a recess that felt like the room deciding whether to be ugly. In the hall, the committee clustered around Josiah like flies. The chair whispered something that changed his face. He turned to Jonah and spoke so only he could hear. If you open your mouth too wide, he hissed, we will make a barrel of you and roll you into the lake. Jonah looked at him with the calm he'd worn since the river. You don't know the first thing about barrels, he said. They float if you make them right. That night, between the courthouse and the counting house, a message traveled on bare feet that made no noise. It is tonight. Aunt Mercy carried the spine of it into the quarters behind St. Mark's, where a congregation met under the pretense of sharing hymns. Pike brought the mind of it, warrants tucked inside a book of common prayer. Jonah brought the heart, a ledger page copied in his careful hand with the committee's names and the phrase Committee of Receivers Mutual Aid, written as if it had been meant to be read in a courtroom. They met in the only place in the city the committee would never expect, A funeral parlor because men who think they own death never imagine it could host a meeting they weren't invited to. The parlor director, a Creole woman who had seen more of humanity than humanity had seen of itself, opened the back room and set out chairs. She set a pot of coffee that could have dissolved a spoon. She watched the door with the calm of someone accustomed to people who arrive without skin and leave looking like themselves again. Pike came with 2 deputies who were good at hearing the needs of the moment. Aunt Mercy brought 6 men from the docks who had their own reasons to hate the committee. Jonah stood behind an empty coffin with the lid propped, as if demonstrating an exhibit to a jury made of ghosts. Josiah arrived because the chair told him to. Cruelty dressed as advice. If you do not, they will tell a story with you in it, and you won to get to correct the verbs. He walked in smelling of laudanum and rain. He saw Jonah and laughed because the room demanded a laugh. You truly cannot do anything without props, he said. Pike didn't bother with speeches. He laid out the copied page. He named names. He described how drowning works when the river helps and how it works when men do. He said fraud without savor. He invited Josiah to deny the page. Josiah looked at the writing the way men look at the snakes they once played with as boys. Anyone could have written that, he said too fast. Say the name Calder, Jonah said softly. Josiah's head snapped toward him as if yanked. What? Say your name, Jonah repeated. Not the one you practiced, the one you were born into. The one you made other people suffer under. Say it. The room, which had no judge to gavel it, decided to be a courtroom anyway. Josiah did not say his true name. He couldn't. A man who fakes his death can afford to admit he was ever alive. Then we are done, Pike said, signaling the deputies. The committee chair stood, face politely blank, and turned to go. Men like him do not resist in rooms they don't own. They vanish to regroup. But he had miscalculated the number of doors he controlled. The parlor director stood in the only exit with her hands on her hips. Behind her, dockmen waited with shoulders like door frames. Where you going? Aunt Mercy asked the chair. Sit. Hear the benediction. Word got out the way storms do fast, without asking permission. In the morning, the Picayune ran a notice dressed as discretion. By noon, other men began to remember other names the committee had used to send their troubles around the parish like a traveling show. By dusk, Pike had the chair in a polite jail and Josiah in a less polite one. Jonah went home to the cooperage with his hands shaking for the first time since he'd put them on the coffin. He shored himself up by planing a stave until the wood grew warm under his palm. That night, Josiah sent for him. They met in a room with brick walls that didn't care about human matters. Josiah sat on a stool and tried to make his posture into pride. You could have said nothing, he opened. You could have let me carry you into a better life. You could have learned to enjoy the shade a man like me can cast. You cast a shadow like a gallows, Jonah said. What do you want? Josiah asked finally, knowing there was always an ask. Money? Freedom papers? I can get them. I can get anything. The committee may be inconvenienced, but there are other doors. I want my name to be mine, Jonah said. And I want you to say yours. That's all. Saying a name doesn't make a man, Josiah scoffed. It does if he hasn't spent his life avoiding it. For a heartbeat, Josiah almost obeyed. He almost spoke the syllables that tied him to his first sin and his last. Then pride found his throat and closed it. I am Mr. Caldwell, he said carefully, as if repeating a spell. Then you die, Caldwell, Jonah said. He turned to go. Behind him, Josiah called his shadow a coward. Jonah stopped at the door and said without turning, I am not your shadow. I am your witness. Pike met him on the steps. They'll try to move him, the inspector said. A friend of a friend will find a technicality, a writ that means something in Latin. If he lives long enough to enjoy it, he'll run again. Men like that only ever do two things: borrow and flee. "What do we do?" Jonah asked. Pike shrugged. "I write. You live. We both hope the wind keeps blowing the right direction. You know how endings try to choose the room where they happen. This one tried for the courthouse and failed. Then it tried for the counting house and failed again. It ended where it started, at the river. Somebody left a door unlatched. Somebody greased the right palm and paled the wrong. The jailer yawned too long. Men with pockets full of favors carried Josiah out past the sleeping dog and down to the levee where a skiff rocked like a breath. They pushed him into it and gave him the oars and told him which eddy would treat him kindly. He laughed once because the river loves a man who believes himself its child. He made it as far as Devil's Cut because a story that begins with a lie will always drive you back to the scene of it. He stood the way he had stood, long months ago, arms wide, mouth open like a man savoring weather, and then he saw there were figures on both banks. On one side, committeemen who'd learned nothing, here to shepherd their investment. On the other, Aunt Mercy, a line of dockmen, Pike with his hat off, and Jonah, who did not shout this time. "Say your name," Jonah called, voice carrying flat over water. "Say it or go under the wrong one and never rise." Wind hushed as if the marsh held its breath. Josiah opened his mouth and chose to live as a lie until the end. Called he began, and the river, which had been patient far longer than it owed anyone, rose like a hand and took hold. The skiff spun, caught, and went over. He didn't have a second trick left. Men on the committee bank shouted orders at the water declined. It gave back a hat that spun in a single oar. It kept the rest. Pike's men dragged with hooks because that is what law does when it wants tidy endings. They found nothing they could lift. The marsh swallowed like a partner who doesn't need applause. Someone muttered 13 because people love to count where it hurts. They went home before the gnats learned their names. In the morning, a clerk wrote a report that named no miracles. The court recorded that J. Pierce Caldwell, alleged, perished by misadventure. The committee of receivers, seeing its mirror, smashed it and swore it was a window. A few men were charged and learned to plead. Most were in ta'i and learned nothing. Pike filed papers that made a noise like closure. Jonah took his copy of the ledger page and Aunt Mercy's thread-wrapped charm and walked to a church that preached with the windows open. He stood with a minister who understood papers and how to make them matter across state lines. He learned the sound of a stamp that reads manumission in a language that used to say otherwise. He signed his name, his and no other, with a hand that shook once and then steadied. He worked in the Chupatulas cooperage through another season and then another. Saving coin in a jar Aunt Mercy kept under flour. When the jar grew heavy enough to change his gait, he bought a seat on a mail coach that would carry him north, and then he gave the seat to a woman with 2 children and took the roof instead. At the Tennessee line, he got off and didn't say why. He went where men who've seen the inside of other men's lies go, into the honest dark that farmers wake from before dawn. He built barrels that carried whiskey clean and rainwater cleaner. He married who he loved in a clearing with a hymn and a promise, and no witnesses who wanted to sell the story. Sometimes in winter, when rain rings on the roof like small coins, he dreams of a skiff tipping and a hat spinning and a voice calling a name it couldn't to finish. He wakes, listens for his children's breathing, and thanks rivers for their memory. What remains on paper is what law allows. What lives in the mouth is what people keep. In St. Matthias Parish, mothers still tell their boys not to practice drowning where the current writes backwards. And old women still hum that a man's true name will fetch him home or fetch him under. In New Orleans, the cooperage still smells of casks and sugar. A nail in the back beam has a bit of red thread tied to it and nobody takes it down. On a ledger in Pike S. files, a page reads Committee of Receivers Defunct in ink that has not faded. He likes that word. Defunct. It means a thing that used to imagine it was a fact. You've walked this river with us, and now we stand at the bank with the dark water taking everything that doesn't belong. Do you think Josiah S. Bones ever let go? Do you think names drown? Or do they float up when somebody speaks the truth out loud? Tell me what you think below. If you found yourself holding your breath and wanting the light left on, subscribe to Tales Never Told and tap that bell, so these stories find you first. Share this with someone who believes endings are only what the powerful write. The rest of us know better. We remember, we listen, and we come back next time.